So we've covered some interesting reasons on why we should regather as a church. We covered fellowship, worship, serving, learning, and growth. All reasons why people should regather to the church and why regathering is the only way to do those five things. If you're interested in those reasons, please check out the previous videos. So we just want to summarize that, but ask a really poignant question. Why is it, Pastor Matt, that you think some people may not want to regather?
So I think first there's two big reasons that pop in my head. First is fear, and some is validated, and some probably isn't validated. Um, some people either live with elderly parents or live with people who might be immunocompromised, or they're nervous about their own health, or they have got asthma, or they have these different health concerns. And those people, I just want to encourage you, stay home. There are
Yeah.
some people out there that this is not meant for you. You need to stay home, and you can worship with us online. You can continue to do all the things
Yep.
that you've been doing. I just continue to push you forward in your spiritual growth. Make sure you're in your Bible. Make sure that you're, calling somebody each week to hold you accountable, things like that. But I also think there's another group, and this is kind of the scary group, that might be using the situation in the world as an excuse not to do what God has called them to do.
We never do that, do we?
I think that we do sometimes. I
Okay.
think that we do.
Continue.
So I've been reading this book by John Piper called Desiring God, and I've read it a few times, but this time this point really stuck out to me. It's called "A Trapped Animal Will Chew Off Its Leg," and Pastor John's talking about the woman at the well, and how Jesus
Yeah.
meets this woman and tells her about this living water, and she kind of starts to realize what it's about, and so she basically says, "What do I got to do?" And Jesus says, "Well, you got some sin in your life, right? You got, the guy who you're with now isn't your husband, and you had many husbands before, and basically you're committing adultery and all these problems in her life." And I'm just going to read this. It says, "Sin is like spiritual leprosy. It deadens your spiritual senses so that you rip your soul to shreds and you don't even feel it. But Christ lays bare her spiritual leprosy. He says, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're sleeping with now is not your husband. Now watch the universal reflex of a person trying to avoid conviction." She has to admit that he's extraordinary. She's like, "Wow, you must be a prophet. You know things that you shouldn't know." But instead of going the direction he pointed to basically the remission of her sin, to
Yeah.
confession, instead of going that way, she tries to switch it. She immediately takes it and is like, "Yeah, I've got sin in my life, but here's some problems that you may want to consider." So she says, "Our fathers used to worship on the mountaintop, but the Jews worship in Jerusalem. They say that's the only place where people ought to worship. What's your position on this issue, Jesus? What is your thoughts on this?"
She sort of try to redirect
So
him.
she's like, "Yeah, I've got sin in my life, but maybe if I sneak attack over here and get him involved in this political controversy
Mm.
or the sociological controversy, maybe I won't really have to deal with my sin."
Wow.
And Jesus obviously doesn't really take the bait. He's like, "Hey, you can worship wherever you want. In the future we're gonna have, I'm gonna die on the cross and raise from the dead, and people are gonna worship at homes and churches. They're gonna worship everywhere. And we need to worship our Father in spirit and in truth. So
Amen.
so there's an element of, I don't want to get too deep into the worship stuff, but there's a true element to our worship. Like, it needs to be based on facts from the Bible. And there's also a spiritual element, a fervor, a desire that needs to come from our hearts. And ultimately, though, I think where this hits the road with what's going on right now is I do think there are some people who have basically just made the decision, maybe I don't need church. You know, like, maybe the sin in my life, I'm kind of enjoying. I'm kind of enjoying it. It's kind of been nice not to have that conviction in my life of going to church.
Right.
Maybe I log on for a few minutes just to wave hi to my friends, and maybe I can get off and, I can eat my Cheerios in peace. That I don't
Yeah.
have to worry about putting on my Sunday best and getting the kids ready
Yeah.
and doing all this stuff. Maybe it's just better for me. And maybe I have sin in my life. I think that there's a lot of unconfessed sin going on right now. If you look at
Wow.
divorce rates, if you look at spousal abuse, if you look at
Oh, that's
children
tough.
abuse,
Yeah.
all those things since Corona has started are are headed up. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of people out there who's saying, you know what? Maybe this sin stuff isn't so bad.
Wow.
And ultimately, Jesus is the great soul hunter. And he proves that in this situation. He doesn't take the bait. He reorients her back to that spiritual water. And that's ultimately what we're hoping to do
Yeah.
through this video is we want you to know that church is a place where we get the spiritual water. We get
Yeah.
this spiritual water so we can keep going, so we can persevere together. And
Sometimes, it requires, it's tough sometimes. It requires some sacrifice. It requires some, for her to kind of experience Jesus. It was probably difficult for her to accept like this conversation about what's really happening in my life. And
yeah,
it's a lot easier to your point, it's a lot easier to talk about sort of things that don't hit home in a sense, like they aren't, it's out there, it's not in here. And so, um, it requires coming back to church and regathering.
yeah, and
It may require some hard decisions for some folks.
and there's pain in it. Nobody likes pain. People would rather kind of continue with the fluff and continue with
Yeah.
not really having to deal with their issues. And that's what the woman does at the well. She's like, man, maybe if I just kind of fluff it up and start talking about politics or where to worship, things like that, maybe Jesus won't really dig in on this sin. And Jesus doesn't allow that.
Yeah,
And
so
we don't want to allow that either.
So just thankful for God that we're able to have a church family where we can have fellowship, worship, service. We
Yeah.
can learn together and grow together in our relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
It may be tough, but we're in it together, right?
Amen.